This episode goes out to iTunes reviewer Vividest Sky. You truly are the Vividest Sky. Hi there, Garrett Robinson here. Welcome to the 9th episode of the Nightblade Epic Podcast, Season 3. I'm going to keep today's message short, listener. Just wanted to remind you that if you want to get Underrealm books for yourself or a loved one for the holidays, it would be smart to order them now. Shipping times are getting more unpredictable every week, and it's harder and harder for me to keep books in stock. Once we sell out of the books we've got, we're probably not getting any more until next year. So, pop on over to underrealm.net/books today. You can order books from the Nightblade Epic, the series you're listening to on this very podcast, or any of the other incredible books of Underrealm. Or you can get the full hardcover collection, 10 awesome books in 4 awesome volumes for one awesome price. They make a fantastic present, and it's also the best possible way to support the podcast. Once again, that's underrealm.net/books. Okay, now it's time for today's episode. Today, you're getting chapters 12 and 13 of Darkfire. When we left off, Albern had just started teaching Lauren the ancient secrets of Colentin archery. Enjoy! Darkfire, Chapter 12. Albern spent the rest of that day instructing Lauren in the Colentin craft of archery. First, he told her to remove the quiver from her back. "In most lands, archers wear the quiver as you do," said Albern. "They think only of the movement of their legs and not of shooting. A quiver on the waist may be cumbersome at first, and you will often spill your arrows, but it is like a muscle. The more you travel thus, the more naturally it will come to you, until you move with the quiver at your side like another leg." Lauren tried firing with the arrows on her waist, but it was difficult. She was so used to drawing arrows from her back that this new motion came strangely. But she gritted her teeth and tried again. She did not loose the arrow, but only tried to perfect her draw. She placed the arrow to the left of the bow, the way she always had. Albern stopped her again. "That, too, is wrong. People in the southern lands think that lends you more accuracy, but only one thing helps guide your arrows true, and that is practice. Spend enough time with the arrow on the right, and you will shoot as fine as you ever did the other way." Lauren tried, but the arrow bounced from the bow's right side. "How do I hold it steady?" Albern raised his eyebrow. "You have answered your own question, by holding it steady." She twisted the nock until the arrowhead came back against the bow. It put a tremendous strain on her hand, which almost cramped. She winced with the pain. Out of curiosity, she glanced over at Albern's hands and saw for the first time how thickly muscled they were. "Something else I shall gain only with practice," she thought to herself. She ground her teeth and held the arrow steady, but she could not draw while maintaining its position, and the arrow began to drift. "Try holding it with your left thumb," said Albern. "That is a terrible way to shoot, and your arrow will shoot wide more often than not, but it can help ease the strain on your right hand and arm while you are learning." She tried again and again. All the rest of that day until sundown, Lauren drew and drew, never loosing a shaft. Her arm burned with pain, but she kept going. The motion felt unnatural no matter how often she repeated it, but still she pressed on. When the sun set for the day and they prepared for rest, Albern gave her a small nod of approval. "You have grit. I've tried teaching this to archers before. Most often, they give up." "It took me more than a day to learn how to shoot the wrong way," said Lauren. "I will not be surprised if it takes twice as long to learn to do it right." "It might take more than that," said Albern. "Your muscles will remember your old training for a long while yet. Do not listen to them. Your mind must rule them until at last they learn the way. They slept well through the night. Jordell and Albern split the watch, for neither man was very tired despite the hard ride of the day before. Lauren woke to a gray dawn, yet it seemed brighter and more hopeful than many of their days in the Great Rocks so far. She ate quickly and threw on her quiver to practice. Albern watched in admiration. "Good," he said. "Already you were quicker than yesterday." "Yesterday I was ready to faint from weariness." "If ever you should wish it, once you have your skill about you, I could speak to many sellsword captains across the 9 lands on your behalf. They all want good fighters, but an archer who knows the Colentin craft is prized above many." Lauren tried not to turn up her nose as she replied, "I thank you, but the life of a mercenary holds little appeal to me." Albern shook his head. "Your pardon. I had forgotten your vow. I shall put the matter from my mind." They mounted as soon as Jem had finished his meal, which Lauren swore was bigger than anyone else's, though she did not know how that could be when Jordell was rationing them so carefully. Once they set out upon the mountain pass, Lauren's fine mood dampened. In the alcove they had had a sense of safety, even if a false one. Now upon the road it was easier to recall the satyr attack, the looks on their savage faces as they charged with their spears, and the terrible bleeding that poured from their throats. She found herself looking up the mountainside, always fearing to see the goat men perched above, watching, waiting for their chance to strike. But the day passed quickly and quietly, and just after midday the sun even broke through the clouds for a while. But despite the fine day, Lauren often caught Annis looking solemn, or mayhap worried. Lauren had taken Midnight to the rear of the line after the satyr attack to guard against any attack there, but that put Annis directly behind Jordell and Zane, and the girl let the plow horse drift far behind them, as though she were afraid to draw too close. When Lauren caught glances of her face, she could see fear in the girl's eyes, which changed to worry when she looked at Zane. When they stopped for a midday meal, Jordell took Albern on a bit farther to scout the next turns in the pass. Jem ran after them, like a puppy following its master. They left Zane bound on the ground, and though the wizard slept, Annis still sat as far from him as she could, even leaning to the side so there was no chance of touching him. Lauren sat beside her. "What troubles you today? There is a great worry in your eyes, or mayhap a great fear." Annis looked down at the bread in her hands. "It is nothing," she mumbled. With a hand on the girl's shoulder, Lauren leaned closer. "Annis, I want to help." She looked over at Zane and then back at Lauren. "You know I do not like that Jordell brought Zane with us. I hate what he did to us in Wellmont and what he did to me. Yet after the satyrs attacked, the way that Jordell—" Lauren thought she understood. Jordell's wrath had been terrible. Always the mystic had been like a font of serenity, and she had been amazed how even-tempered he was, even in the face of Zane's obstinate rebellion. And it was not only the wizard. When the rest of them had hated Vivian and mistrusted her, Jordell had shown her only courtesy and respect. Even when she sought to expose him for helping Zane, who had consumed mage-stones despite the king's law, Jordell had looked on the woman with understanding and mercy, and not with hatred. Yet Lauren did not doubt that Jordell had meant his threat to destroy Zane, and he had beaten the wizard mercilessly. It had been a terrifying display, and Lauren could find no fault in Annis's fear. But could she find fault with Jordell? His greatest concern seemed to be their safety. Lauren knew how highly he valued Zane. To be driven to such rage by the wizard's actions, he must care deeply for Lauren and the children, even more deeply than he often let on. Could Lauren condemn his anger when she, too, was furious with Zane for all he had done? Looking at Zane now, though, she found it hard to muster much ire against him. He had shed great patches of his hair. She could see his cheekbones pressing sharp against the skin, and his hands were like a skeleton's dressed in parchment. Jordell had to tighten his bonds every day because of how his body wasted away. It did not matter how much food they crammed around the gag that kept him from using his magic. His body was eating itself away from the inside. She realized suddenly that Zane might die. He looked for all the world like one stricken by a terrible illness, the way Chet's mother had looked back in the birchwood when her body failed her and seemed to melt into nothing. No doubt if she had tried to traverse the mountain pass through the great rocks, the journey would have been the death of her. Would it now be the end of Zane? It was a troubling question, and one for which she had no answer. So she only reached out and put an arm around Annis, pulling the girl close. To her surprise, slow tears leaked from Annis's eyes. I wanted him to die, said Annis, her voice breaking. I feel such shame in it, but truly I did. That hate sat with me like a festering wound, and I despised myself for it, yet I could not be rid of it. And then I thought I might get my wish, and it was awful. It seemed like something my mother would have asked for. After so long trying to escape her, I have become just like her. You are not, said Lauren quickly. Your mother would have had no qualms about what Jordell did. You thought you wanted him punished, yet when you saw that punishment carried out, you knew you were wrong. You are a daughter of the family Yeren in body, but I do not think they own your mind. She tugged Annis closer and planted a kiss on the top of her head, rubbing her shoulder gently. But what of Jordell? Is he then like my mother? Have I run from one whose violence I abhorred, only to ride with another who will behave the same when provoked? That is a harder question, for I would never have suspected such a display from Jordell. Yet I do not see it in the same light. The mystic is a good man, his patience often bordering on foolishness. Yet Zane has done great evil while we have known him. We have seen him kill. He has lied and stolen from us, and he struck you with fire. I do not understand Jordell's desire to save him, but in trying to do so, he has let Zane push him to the brink of madness, and that I do understand. The wizard has turned both your minds far darker than they would be otherwise. They heard Albern's voice as he approached with the others. Annis scrubbed furiously at her eyes with the back of her sleeve, and they hastened to stand. By the time Jordell, Albern, and Jem returned, Lauren stood nonchalantly over Zane, while Annis made a show of checking her saddlebags. The rest of the day passed without much event, except that near nightfall the clouds returned, and it began to rain once more. Jem groaned as the first drops fell, and Albern hastened to find them a shelter. It was not long before he spotted a cave and explored it, soon returning with news that it was shallow and empty. But in that short time the skies had already begun to pelt them. They ran inside quickly and shook the rainwater off before hobbling the horses. Empty it is now, but not always, said Jordell, pointing to some dried dung barely visible in the failing sunlight. At least that will be good for a fire. Albern started it quickly, and despite the smell, they soon had gathered around the flames for warmth. After a quick meal, they were all eager for bed. In dreams, they did not have to suffer the cold and the grumbling of their never-quite-filled stomachs. But Lauren had first watch. It seemed an excellent chance to practice her draw, so she fetched her bow and belted on her quiver. Her muscles screamed almost immediately, the pain intense after the day's reprieve. She ignored it. Aches and sores had never kept her from learning before. The sound of arrows whisking from her quiver joined the crackling, noisome fire and the rain outside, and Jem's snores. So Lauren never heard the footsteps behind her, nor the whoosh of air before something crashed into the back of her head, and she fell to the ground in blackness. Darkfire, Chapter 13. Lauren's eyes refused to focus when first they opened, and her head swam in agony. Small hands shook her hard, bumping her skull against the rocky cave floor, and she cried out from the pain. "Leave her be," barked Jordell. "Her head is tender." She opened her eyes just in time to see Jordell shove Jem away. The boy had been shaking her frantically, his eyes wide with terror. "Lauren," said Jordell, "can you hear me?" She opened her mouth and tried to answer, but only a croak came out. She nodded instead, but that nearly made her fall senseless at the pain shooting through her skull. "Here, have some water." He raised a skin to her mouth. Lauren thought it might choke her, but he poured gently so that only a few drops came out. It touched her tongue like the sweetest honey, and she swallowed greedily. He gave her a little more. "What has happened?" said Annis, and Lauren heard a rustling out of sight. A moment later the girl's face appeared, looking at Lauren in horror. "Lauren, are you all right?" "It was Zane," said Jordell. "He loosed his bond somehow and escaped." Jem's face reddened with fury, and his fists clenched at his sides. "You said you knew how to bind him, and now he has nearly killed Lauren." Jordell did not reply with the same anger. He only looked worried. "I do not understand it myself. The bond should have held." "Mayhap this answers the question," said Alburn. Lauren looked to him despite the pain and saw him holding a frayed rope. The ends had been burned. He crawled to the fire and thrust his hands into it. "But that would have roasted his flesh," said Annis. "It must have hurt terribly." "It would have," said Jordell, mouth set in a grim line. "But a trapped fox will gnaw its own leg off to be free." "What time was it when he hit you?" said Alburn. "How long has he been gone?" Lauren tried to remember, then realized she did not know what time it was now. Outside the cave, a pale gray light shone through the clouds. No sun, at least not yet, but only the first grasping fingers of its rays, wrapping over the tops of the eastern mountain range as it pulled itself above the horizon. "Both moons had just set," said Lauren. She could hear her dry throat cracking. She reached for the water skin again, and Jordell handed it to her. "That means he has a few hours lead," said Alburn. "But he is not well, not by any stretch. I think we can catch him easily. And we had best do so, for if the satyrs find him first, he will be easy prey in his state." "Let them have him, then," said Jem, stamping a foot. Jordell looked at him with a frown, but Annis spoke up as well. Is it wise to pursue him? After all, he still has his magic, and we have only swords." "I do not fear him." Jem looked down at Lauren, and his eyes softened. "I only think he deserves whatever he finds upon his own road, if he is so determined to take it." Jordell frowned and looked out of the cave. To Lauren's shock, she saw doubt warring with the anger in his expression. Never before had she seen him waver when asked to leave Zane behind. Lauren seized his sleeve and pulled herself up. She could not sit all the way upright, for her head spiked with terrible pain, and she nearly fell. But she forced her eyes to stay open and locked them on Jordell's. "We cannot leave him. We must find him before he gets himself killed." Jordell's eyes widened, and he looked at her in wonder. Jem's shock was nearly comical. "After what he did to you, you still wish to risk all our lives for his?" said the boy. "I do. We can do nothing else." Lauren looked past Jem to Annis. "You told me that when you saw Zane hurt, it did not feel like you thought it would, that it nearly made you ill. Now you hope to cast him aside, out of sight, where you will not have to witness such suffering. But it is the same thing, Annis. It is not nobler to let him starve than it would be to hurl him from a cliff." Tears welled in Annis's eyes, and she turned away, but Jordell looked only at Lauren. "You, too, have hinted at leaving Zane behind," he said. She released her hold on his sleeve to push herself farther up, but her head slumped forwards and swam, threatening to make her vomit. She raised her knees on either side of her face, taking several deep breaths until the feeling subsided. "I wanted to leave him, it is true. And yes, he struck me. But can you not see that he stayed his hand as well? No doubt Jem thinks he meant to kill me, But if that were his intent, what stopped him? He could have taken a knife and slit all your throats as you slept. But he showed mercy in the end. Often you have spoken of giving Zane another chance, and I never understood why. But you promised there was something worth saving inside of him. Do you still think that? For if you have changed your mind, you only did so after changing my own. Jordell softened, as though the keen blue ice of his eyes had melted into a warm pool. He bowed his head like a man in prayer. You humble me with your mercy, Lauren of the family Nelda, for I had forgotten to show any myself. You are right. We will not abandon him. As dark as his deeds have been of late, still he has done many good things with his days, and may do more still to balance the scales. What things? Said Jem. I have seen no such deeds. You have known him only a few months, while I have known of him most of his life, said Jordell. When we reclaim him, I shall tell you some of it. But now we must hasten, for even weakened he has had much time to gain a lead. They hurried to ready their horses. Jordell finished securing his bags first and turned to Lauren. Come, I require your assistance before we venture forth. Lauren looked at Annis and Jem, but they only shrugged. So she followed Jordell to the front of the cave, where he stooped to pick up an ember from the fire with his thick leather gloves. This he carried beyond the cave mouth, with Lauren hastening to keep up. The quick pace jostled her head, and she placed a hand upon the back of it. The injury there was still tender, and she winced. Once they were out of sight and earshot of the others, Jordell turned to her. We may be able to track Zane on the mountain pass, for you and I both know something of woodcraft, and I suspect Alburn outshines us both. Yet even he might lose the trail, for still there is the rain, and much of the ground is hard and rocky. But there is something we can do to find Zane unerringly. It is a secret of the mage hunters, long lost in history, for we have had little opportunity to use it. You must never speak of this to anyone, the same as you would never whisper word of your dagger. Lauren's hand went to the weapon's hilt on instinct, and she nodded. I swear it. What must I do? Jordell held out a hand. Give it to me. She drew the dagger and flipped it to catch the blade, before placing the hilt in his hand. Jordell took it with reverence, holding it with fingertips like a fine gem. Then he knelt, placing on the ground the ember he had drawn from the fire. His hand vanished into his vest pocket, and when it came forth, he held a lock of dark hair. Whose is that? Said Lauren, but even as she spoke, she guessed the answer. Zane's. I have told you one gift of your dagger, that it is proof against his magics. This is another, and one of the weapon's chief purposes. Though I thought my bonds would hold him, still I collected this lock of hair, just in case he should escape. Jordell placed the dagger atop the coal to heat the blade. After it had sat there for a moment, he dropped the lock atop it. The strands began to burn, and soon had vanished in flame and a puff of smoke. Nothing happened for a moment. Lauren stared at the dagger and the coal, ready for anything. Yet no warning could have prepared her for what she saw. The black designs worked into the dagger's blade, which Jordell had told her were made of magestone, began to shift and twist. Like the branches of a tree in the wind, they twined and snaked about each other, grasping, exploring. Then all of a sudden they took on new life and stretched. North they pointed, north and slightly east, directly along the mountain pass. That will tell us where Zane has gone, said Jordell. I took a good deal of hair, and the design should not rest until he is found. They will always point in his direction. Take the dagger back now, Lauren. You may sheathe it if you wish. The magic will not be affected. Though Lauren had hesitated to give it to him, now she paused equally before taking the dagger back. It seemed to her something strange and alien, a weapon of legend, and not the simple, if beautiful tool she had believed it to be when she stole it. With a fluttering heart, she took it at last, sliding it into its sheath with a whisper. "You have a cunning task ahead of you now," said Jordell. "For as we ride, you must look at the dagger often to see if we are going the right way. Yet above all, you must not let Albern see it. I think he is a good man, and I trust him. Yet he may have masters unknown to us. It is best if not even Annis and Jem see you looking at it." "I shall remember," said Lauren with a nod. "I will not let them see." They returned to the cave and found the others ready to set forth. Albern gave Lauren and Jordell a curious look, but he did not ask where they had been. He only led them from the cave, and after inspecting the ground for a moment, he spotted the remains of footprints trailing north and east along the pass. "He went north," said the bowyer in surprise. "I thought he might turn south, heading for tamer lands. Mayhap he thought that would be our guess." "Then lead on, and keep a wary eye for his steps," said Jordell. "I shall," said Albern. "Only do not be angry with me if the satyrs find him first." They mounted, and Albern led the way north on the pass. Jordell gave Lauren a look as they followed, and her hand tightened on the hilt of her dagger. This has been a production of Legacy Books, written and narrated by Garrett Robinson. The music in this podcast was created by Will Musser. Check out his incredible work at willmusser.com. That's WILLMUSSER.com. Today's letter is I. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.